Cool.
All right.
Take it away, Craig.
Thanks. So yeah, the request for this meeting arose out of our discussions about having different schemas in the same database, especially with respect to the container registry. And if I remember what Sid said correctly, he said, I need to be educated on this subject. So here we are. And the question came up early last week, and there've been a lot of discussions, and the related issues are linked here. And the threads are very long, but we can jump right into the questions that came up from this and refer back to the issues if we need to. So the question from Sid was, what's the current plan? And Dan, you have the answer there if you want to verbalize.
Certainly. Yeah, a separate schema, same database is the plan where we would like to move forward with. And we could get into more detail. We could do separate database like this. It's configurable. It's an option that we can actually choose at various installation points for self-hosted customers. We could have a different setup. It's not a hard limit. I think the line where it becomes a more difficult technical implementation is adding it to the current production data store and the same schema owned by the Rails code. And so at that point, it becomes a consideration, but I don't believe having a separate schema in the same database would prevent us from implementing as we need to from a technical standpoint, nor would it impact our ability to have connections across our stages, which I know is very important.
So you can join between connections between stages. Well, I'll take them one at a time. So the size of it, it's like less, is it a % or something of the total size or?
Yeah, so the way this is set up is we're looking to take the manifest data. And so the way that the container registry is set up is we've got a sort of separate file structure for the manifest data as from the actual blobs that make up the images. We want to take that manifest data and pull it into a database. And the estimate that we've been able to sort of get to by looking at our development database is around the 85, 86 gig mark, but that's going to be growing. Once we enable online garbage collection, we'll be able to reduce that, and there should be some reduction. We're thinking around the 40% mark in terms of reduction. So that number could change, but that's the current estimate.
Okay, but it's not, we're not doing this because of size. That's the conclusion.
Correct. That is correct. We are not.
Okay. And then for the benefit, it Dan answered. I just made a question based on that. So like, what do we mean with internal data structures? Are you trying to prevent other apps like the Rails app from peeking into it?
There's no harm in read-only access coming from Rails if that's what you want to do. Because of the nature of this data, it needs to be owned exclusively as far as rights go by the container registry. And the container registry, keeping in mind, is a completely separate application. It's a completely separate code base. There's no reason the Rails code couldn't look at it as a read-only. But if at the point it needs to write it, then we run into all sorts of issues, because this is actually the representative. You could visualize this as the table of contents for what's in the container registry. So we don't want anyone else modifying it, because then we lose the ability to actually maintain that data set. Does that answer your question, Sid?
Not really. What does owned mean?
Just read-only, whether they read-write access. Ideally, the container registry, this actual set of data is not write by anything else. And once it is, it becomes problematic. Oh,
so this other schema is to make sure that there's different permissions to the two schemas?
It's not in. Yeah, that is probably the best net effect from a code perspective. Yeah, from a technical perspective.
Okay, but they're in the same database, so you'd have different users with like different passwords.
We wouldn't need to, I don't think. I don't want to step too far into understanding the database configuration that the database team would need to set up. But from the perspective of the container registry code, it's treating this like its own data so that it can track what blobs from the images are actually stored somewhere. So while it's doing that, when it wants to do online garbage collection, it's using this instead of looking at a file system. It's using their database to go through and determine what things exist, what tags are referred to.
I'm totally for putting this in the database instead of the file system. I'm just trying to understand the benefit in putting it in a different schema.
Yeah, it really is ownership. I think that's a fair summary then.
And the ownership, like, I still don't have my hands around it, as in I don't understand it yet. How is the ownership different if it's in a different schema? Can you say, will it be like different users? Is there like some access control difference?
I think, Andreas, I'm not sure if you unmuted. I don't want to keep talking when I'm sort of not clear exactly on how that would be implemented as far as separate users, but I'll give you a second. Do you want to answer that or do you want me to?
Yeah, sure. If we dial back a bit, I think what we really want is acknowledging the fact that those are separate services, separate components, and they should own their own database. So what we actually want is a sort of a separation for the data and also for the services so that they don't step on each other's toes. And what you naturally or typically do is putting that in separate databases because that's already giving you that physical separation of the data, right? And what you avoid by doing that is using the database as a means to communicate between services, right? So even allowing read-only access from one application to tables that is owned by the other application is what I would think is an anti-pattern to do, because then you use it as a communication way between applications. That is something I think we should avoid, and I think that's what you typically do by putting it in separate databases. If we really wanted to do that in the same schema, we would have to think about permissions management, I think, more. So even there, it would be possible to separate stuff so that those can't overlap. What I'm not seeing really is where the benefit from that, from putting the same, from putting both in the same schema comes from, or in the same database, sorry, in two different schemas. What do we gain from that? Even if it was possible to implement proper permissions and all that, what is the benefit coming from that?
And so I think the main benefit that is really whether having separate databases enables us to partition and manage scalability of our data.
We were talking about separate schemas, right?
Yeah.
And now you're talking about separate databases?
Yeah, so this is why this is one that the original question is that you asked, Sid, was what is the current plan, right? That was the first question. And the current plan in terms of where we got to, we were working towards an integrated schema to support our ability in terms of partitioning or whatever the database team needs to do going forward. But it's a configuration, it's implementation detail as far as container registry is concerned. So if it's determined that we can achieve all of those results from a separate database, separate schema, same database, the container registry it's not a big deal for us. So I'm working towards integrated schema, separate schema, same database, because that seemed like, based on what I understood from the discussion, to support everyone's needs and the concerns that we'd have around our turbos, as I watched that video to make sure I was up on it, right?
So let me chime in. I think there's two benefits to having a separate schema. One is that you don't have to worry about name collisions on the tables. So for example, if container registry names schema migrations as a table, suddenly if you got these two different tables that, both the Rails and the container registry are thinking of their own, there's going to be a conflict there. The second thing is you could have granular permissions there, right? Like you could set up a separate user that restricts only read access to the container registry tables. And, so it's not something we've, actually pushed yet, but that is a potential. But I think the naming complex is the big one.
Okay. And so you can restrict users to certain schemas, even though it's all within the same database?
I believe so, Andres. If I'm correct, you can grant permissions to certain schemas to different users.
That's correct, yes. I think those benefits, you also get them from separate databases. You don't have to do anything about it because they're separate by definition.
Let's keep it simple for me because I have a hard time tracking. Let's only talk about what we're currently proposing. Like, what's the benefit of a separate schema? Otherwise, we'll start going around in circles. So you can restrict users to a certain schema, but you can't restrict users to a certain table.
No, you can be as granular as you like, but that you have to manage that. But you can have permissions as you like that.
Okay, so that's not really a benefit of a separate schema.
Well, it's easier to kind of group them, right? Because how do you have to make sure you know which tables belong to which, whether the container registry or the Rails. So it is, it isn't really, I mean, if you knew all the tables, you can enumerate them, sure. But then it's easier just to say container registry dot, star is everything.
Yep. Okay, so it's easier now technically. Okay, that makes sense. So far I get the grouping for permission giving, and I get the preventing name collisions. What's the name of schema 1? Like, what's the name of the schema we're using today?
It's public. That's the default schema. That's the only one we have.
Cool. How would we do migrations?
Yeah, the container registry code would handle that project would handle all the migrations.
Okay, is there a migration kind of service in that project today?
There is not. What
would we use?
The best example is Prefect. We're using some third-party tool called SQL Migrate, which does a lot of the same things that the Rails schema migration does. So that's one model that we could be using. But again, it uses the same table name. So that could easily, if you happen to use this tool and touch the Rails code, you could, easily blow up the Rails application side.
So we'd have to get another tool in kind of the container registry.
It's just a library that you can pull in easily.
Okay.
And
cool.
that would be a mirror to the active record migrations in Rails. So a similar type of concept. So the concept is the same.
Do we have experience with doing another schema? So like we're doing a non-public schema?
Andreas, do you have a database or Stan?
To my knowledge, not. No, we always use the default schema, I think.
Yeah, that's correct. I think it is a little tricky with PG Bouncer because if you mess with the search path, right, you could easily cause problems. So we did see that when we were setting up Geo, where Geo, I think, was tinkering with that search path, and we saw some issues there. So that is something to be concerned about. That's why I think Andreas is pushing the separate database, because it's a lot harder to make those kind of mistakes.
Okay, so I assume that on GitLab.com it might be a separate database, and for self-managed it wouldn't be a separate database. Is that where we're going, or is that still up in the air?
So for GitLab.com, I think we already know that we have concerns adding that data or that workload to the existing cluster. So that's why we would have to keep that separate. That already means we have to use a separate database as well.
And it was, Sid, that was a question that came up late last week. Like, would it make sense to kind of separate those concerns so self-managed gets the default 2 schemas on one database, and yeah, .com goes and we can configure it, because like Dan said, it's an implementation detail at that point in time. It's pretty easy to separate the 2 out.
Yep.
I will find the comment in the issues, but yes, it's being discussed.
Let's skip 14 because it leads to 15. What I'm afraid of is at some point we'll discover like, oh, we wanted to query the data in that, what are we going to call it? Container repositories is the name of the table.
Oh, sorry, that's the internal. So the 2 parts of this data, Sid, is we've got customer-facing tables within our current schema. And that data is actually being served up via the Rails app to our customers. The schema we're talking about building, the one that initiated this conversation, is internal and is not intended to be joined. There's no related data. We're not tracking project IDs or usernames or any of that stuff. It's not related. It's all interface via an API and API calls.
And what data is in there?
Container repositories is the name of the actual table that is the customer facing data, and it's the similar data that you had called out around our package repositories. It's that same sort of information. It is linking to customers. It is linking to projects.
And so if I want to see how much storage a certain user is using, I'd need to query that.
That is a problem that we have right now, being able to identify specific customers' data usage, and it is something we're actively working on. Infrastructure team, I believe, has been working on. I don't want to call the wrong teams out, but we have been working on identifying that. The solution we're proposing of bringing this, and I don't want to sound like I'm repeating myself, but bringing this into our Postgres cluster actually allows us to do a better job of this. Rather than where it's at right now.
Yeah, but that's the move from having it in the file system to having it in the database. And this call is not me arguing with bringing it from the file system to the database. This call is me getting educated of like why not in the public schema. And I'm getting a bit concerned now because we're spending $10 million a year on free users, and a lot of that is on storage. And getting that right seems a big task, and no one has put their hands around it yet. Like we don't have a great way forward there. And now suddenly we're making that data kind of outside of the Rails app. So that might be harder because like we have to block someone's, or this is all assuming a lot, but like at some point you've reached your limit and you shouldn't be able to push anymore. But now it's hard to determine when a person has reached that limit because we have that schema that is not part of the main Rails app.
Yeah, and
this is just an example. Like I think over time we'll find more things like where we want to show in the GitLab interface exactly like whether something was, I don't know, garbage collected or something like that.
Yeah, 100%. And we want to move towards that as well. Like that's really important. And there is an epic or issues around tracking that data usage. And I'll need to track those down for you, Sid. I apologize, I don't have those right now, but there is an effort towards that right now.
Yeah, I know. And it's a ton of trouble. And that's a ton of trouble when it's in the same database and in the same schema. I don't think it's going to get easier if we move it further away. I think we're going to get stuff where, yeah, now we have to start doing API calls and things like that.
And let's track that as an open question of how we basically address it, because like this is kind of an important area around a reduction. We don't want to reduce in other areas and then find out we just blew it up here, essentially, and we're back to square one.
I would really want to see kind of what data is in there so that we can reason about whether we have to access that from the Rails app at some point. And the link in 15a, maybe I'm missing something, but I don't see the schema there.
Oh, and the reason I put it there is just because that's where João called out the container repositories, the customer-facing data structures within our existing schema. That's why I referenced it right there. So you could remove the link and just refer to the italicized container repositories in the agenda there, Sid.
Sorry, I don't understand. Isn't there like a table layout, like a schema.rb or something like that?
In terms of, I'm not sure I understand that clarification.
What tables and columns are in this thing we want to put into a different schema?
I think I just linked that issue 27.147. I think there's a nice diagram of all the tables that are going to be created.
Ah, yeah, that's helpful. And I've seen this before. I forgot it was there.
Yeah.
So public tags, those are container tags, right? Isn't that something you sometimes want to show in the Rails interface?
It is, and currently, and so the way I look at this is an iteration towards better integration. Currently what's happening, but this helps me make sense of it, so I apologize, I feel like I'm repeating myself, but currently what's happening is we have API calls to the container registry that goes through the file system and then returns results. That's super slow because it's going over file structure.
No one wants that.
Yeah, and so pulling this into the databases, doing that, and so the APIs calls will still be happening, and we're still taking those API calls from the container registry and then pulling that data into these customer-facing tables that we have in our production schema.
Okay, but I see a future where I'm in, I don't know, I'm making this up on the spot, so it's not going to be correct, but feel free to argue with it. But I'm in continuous, I'm looking at my environments. I can see which version is running, and I can also see what the tag is of the container that's running. And I can click that tag and see something else. We shouldn't have that go through an API if we can prevent it. Like, that will just make that page load slower, or make that piece of information appear later, and make everything harder to do. We're talking about 6 tables. I get the benefit of a name collision and stuff like that, but this is not a really, we can make sure that there's no name collisions by just looking at this. The repositories is already taken, but it doesn't strike me as like a super hard problem.
Yeah, name collisions, I don't think it's certainly a benefit of separating schemas or separating the database, but the ownership question of the container registry code, as it's doing a online garbage collection, not having stuff changed by another part of the app. And then when you want to start thinking about,
that's not having stuff changed by another part of that. Like, we got to be super specific what we're doing here. Like, not having stuff changed by another part of the app. You can still have that's not solved with the schema.
No, it isn't solved with the schema, but in terms of accessing the actual data and making changes there, yes, it's something that we can do for sure. We could have it integrated. We could actually write code in Rails to have it understand what those data structures mean. We could build an API on top of that in Rails, but then someone has to do the API calls because we need that boundary around the data ownership so that there's not changes happening in these in this actual schema that we created.
This is the argument for microservices. Like, we need an API to prevent those calls from happening. And what you get is you get a way more complex app. So if this is a way to kind of bring microservices to our monolith, that's a much bigger discussion. I'm willing to have that, but that's very different from a database discussion.
Yeah, check here. We have 2 minutes left in the allotted block.
So it seems that a lot of like what's driving this is like, we want to go to microservices, and I've not heard super convincing arguments. I am very worried, like, we'll put this thing on another database and now I can't see my tags in my GitLab interface anymore.
Yeah, and this is not intended to be an argument for microservices, Sid. This is an existing service that we integrated. It came from Docker Distribution Registry, and it's also pluggable for our customers who want to use Harbor or whatever other solution.
But
there's
that's not how GitLab works. GitLab doesn't work like you can plug anything in, because you get the same problems of DIY ops. That's people have tried that many times, and that's what we're replacing at customers, to plug anything in.
Yeah, the biggest concern about combining the schema is availability in my mind, because like the ownership questions about schema migrations. If the container registry drops a column and Rails suddenly says, "Hey, you just dropped a column and I didn't know about that," we've had a lot of outages due to those kind of issues where we just didn't coordinate that properly. And once you start adding the container registry, different app doing different migrations that Rails doesn't know about, then we can get into real trouble there. So that's my biggest concern about keeping it all in one place.
So we already have, like, you're afraid of the container registry application inadvertently modifying kind of the
well, it may. I mean, if we're saying the container registry is going to change the schema, then if the Rails application knows about that, then there's going to be a world of outages as a result of those kind of issues. So unless you make Rails own every table, then it gets a little tricky.
Cool. Let's dive into that in a next call, stand on what we've seen so far. I think Rails should own this table, and but I'm not sure, like, if we have the container registries that has like a migration every month that we now have to rewrite or something, that is a problem. I can see that. But I'm worried because like, hey, well, for the tags, you just do an API call. Like that's the same disaster that every DIY ops installation is. So that is not where we want to be. So let's discuss this more. I think we need to get to the bottom of this.
Cool. Thanks for your time.
Thanks.